My story this evening, we just passed Mother's Day, and I have a story that's called The Long Tea or the Short Tea.
Go long, baby.
Well, do you want the long tea or the short tea? Now, that's a very simple question, but it's the answer that becomes very complicated when you're 8 years old. My mother stood over me with the teapot, and she, every single night for 365 days out of the year, would ask that simple question. Now, I'm going to tell you a little something about my mother. My mother was born in Stirling, Scotland. She had 12 brothers and sisters. And they were a coal mining town. And eventually they lost 5 of their brothers to the coal miners' disease, which was called the black lung. It reached a point when the family had to be gathered into their living room, and my grandfather looked around at the kids, the 12 of them, and said, "Some of you are going to have to go. I just can't afford to take care of you, and I've taken care of you up to this point in time." Now, my ma said she realized this was coming. She had kind of figured out something was going to happen because the finances were really tough. And so he looked at the family. He looked at the kids. And he said, "Well, all right, you're the coal miners and you kind of bring the money in and so forth." And it got down to my mother and my Aunt Gavina. My grandfather just casually said, "You two have to go." Now, that might not have been too bad in some kind of families that maybe you'd see they got a little older and so forth. But my mother was 12 and my aunt was 14. The next day, they got their stuff in a brown bag and they had to leave. They got to the next town over and they were able to find work as domestics. My mother became the cook. My aunt became the domestic who took care of the children, also the sewing and the knitting in the household. So we had 2 sisters. They were 2 years apart. And now they had 2 different jobs. They worked there for almost 3 years. And the family said, "We're going to go to America. But we can only take one of you." And they decided to take my mother and left my aunt there. It was very hard for the sisters to have to leave one there. My mother came to America and settled in New York. My aunt at that time stayed back there in Scotland. So we had 2 sisters, 2 years apart, 2 different jobs. Now they were 2 different continents apart. They both worked, they both saved their money so that they could be united again. And it took quite a few years to get that to happen. But eventually, I remember my mother taking me and my sister and my father. We went over to Logan Airport and we greeted my aunt coming off of the plane. She was welcomed into our house in Boston. Years would travel on. They both became ill. They had different kinds of diseases. And they both passed on. My mother first. So now we had the 2 sisters, 2 years apart, 2 different jobs, 2 different continents. They were united, and then they died of 2 different diseases. And when it came time to do the funeral, what word am I looking for? The spoken word at my aunt's funeral. I stood there and I said, "You know, these 2 sisters were 2 years apart in age, and now I'm going to bury them 2 feet apart in the same section of Forest Hill Cemetery." So that was their lives. That was the life of my mother. Well, will it be long tea or short tea? And I had to look at my mother straight in the eye, realizing that the answer to her was about me. Me having to explain to my mother if I had done anything wrong that day. If the day had gone and I hadn't done anything wrong, my mother would come with the teapot to the cup of the lip of the cup, to the top of the lip. And she would gently pour that liquid into the cup. And I could add my milk and my sugar. And I'd look up at her and she'd have a broad smile on her face and she'd probably tap me on the top of the hair and say, good. Because she knew I was all right that day, that I hadn't done anything wrong. But when I looked at her and I had to say, I want the long tea, Ma, then she knew that I had done something that day that I wasn't supposed to do. Because I was in the confessional at that time, and I was looking up at the high priest of integrity and honesty. So I had to turn myself in. On that particular occasion, it was me who left the milk out and it spoiled. But I wasn't going to tell anybody. I was going to let somebody else take the blame. My mother said, take the position. I put my two hands around the cup on the base, and I sat there. And my mother came to the teapot and raised that pot 18 to 20 inches above the cup and poured the liquid from there. It poured down, of course, down into the base of the cup and splashed back over, catching the little parts of water on my skin, making me realize that for one evening I was responsible for something, not because there was going to be punishment and it was going to be severe, but the mere fact that I had hurt my mother. And so I had learned at a very early age about truth and honesty. And every single time that I come to a place like here we are tonight, I always check the menu. I always look there to see what the beverage schedules are. Because I'm hoping one time in one of these tea houses, there's going to be a little note and it's going to say, would you like long tea or short tea? Thank you very much.